Officer, before you lock those cuffs, ask yourself one question. Are you enforcing the law or just assuming you're right? The words were calm, almost gentle, but they landed in the humid afternoon air with enough weight to slow every movement around the crowded parking lot. Rookie Officer Ethan Walker barely looked up as he reached for the standard steel handcuffs clipped to his duty belt. It was his third week, wearing the uniform alone, and every decision felt like another chance to prove he belonged. The shopping center parking lot buzzed beneath the bright Georgia sun. Shopping carts rattled across cracked pavement. A delivery truck idled near the loading dock. Somewhere beyond the storefronts, an ice cream truck played a cheerful melody that felt strangely out of place. Ethan had already convinced himself he understood exactly what had happened. A black sedan sat across two spaces beside a clearly painted fire lane. To him, the violation was obvious. Rules existed for everyone. That was what the academy had drilled into him. No exceptions. The woman standing beside the vehicle never raised her voice. She wore a simple navy blouse beneath a light gray jacket, comfortable flats, and a silver watch whose face caught the sunlight each time she folded her hands together. Her expression carried neither fear nor anger, only an unusual patience that unsettled him far more than an argument would have. A few curious shoppers slowed their pace. Someone lifted a phone. Another whispered, "What's going on?" The questions floated through the warm air like drifting leaves, but Ethan refused to notice. Every pair of watching eyes only strengthened his determination. This was exactly how experienced officers earned respect, he told himself. They acted. They didn't hesitate. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "step away from the vehicle." She complied without resistance, taking one measured step backward. "May I explain why I parked here?" she asked. Ethan shook his head before she could continue. "You can explain after I finish my report." She studied his face for only a second, as though searching for something beyond the badge and polished nameplate. "Please finish your report carefully," she replied quietly. The sentence sounded less like a warning than sincere advice, but Ethan dismissed it immediately. He interpreted calmness as confidence, confidence as arrogance. He believed he'd seen that attitude before, people assuming they could talk their way out of consequences. Around them, the afternoon continued without concern. Automatic doors sighed, open, and closed. A child laughed while chasing a loose balloon across the sidewalk. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe, mixing with the heat rising off the asphalt. Ordinary life kept moving, unaware that a single decision was quietly changing several lives at once. Ethan completed the first lines of the citation with deliberate precision, the pen scratching steadily against the clipboard. Every letter looked clean, every box was checked, every procedure seemed correct. Then he secured the handcuffs according to department protocol, informing the woman she was being temporarily detained while the incident was documented. She neither protested nor pulled away. She simply looked toward the courthouse, rising several blocks beyond the intersection, its white stone columns glowing beneath the afternoon sun, before returning her eyes to the young officer. "I hope," she said softly, "that someday you'll understand the difference between authority and judgment." Ethan tightened his jaw, convinced she was trying to intimidate him. He never noticed the growing silence spreading through the crowd. He never noticed several older bystanders exchanging uncertain glances, and he certainly never imagined that before the sun disappeared beyond the city skyline, the entire meaning of that quiet sentence would turn his understanding of justice completely upside down. The ride to the precinct lasted less than 10 minutes, but the silence inside the patrol car felt much longer. The air conditioner hummed steadily against the late afternoon heat, while traffic rolled past in slow waves beyond the windows. Naomi Brooks sat upright in the back seat, her eyes drifting across familiar streets without revealing a single emotion. Ethan Walker kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, replaying the encounter in his mind. He told himself he had followed procedure exactly as he had been trained. The citation had been completed. The detention had been documented. Everything was by the book. Yet her final sentence continued to echo louder than the police radio, crackling softly between dispatch updates. Authority and judgment. The words refused to disappear. When they reached the precinct parking lot, Ethan stepped out first and opened the rear door. Naomi thanked him with a quiet nod before walking beside him through the glass entrance. Several officers looked up briefly from their desks as they entered. Computer keyboards clicked. A printer released another stack of paperwork. The familiar scent of fresh coffee mixed with floor polish floated through the lobby. It was an ordinary afternoon inside the station, but something subtle shifted as strangers waiting near the reception desk glanced toward Naomi with curious expressions. She did not appear frightened. She did not appear angry. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone completely at ease inside government buildings. Ethan noticed it, but quickly dismissed the thought. Sergeant Daniel Ross emerged from the hallway, carrying a folder beneath one arm. He stopped when he saw Ethan escorting the woman inside. "Parking incident?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "She refused to move the vehicle, Sergeant. I completed the detention according to policy." Ross looked briefly toward Naomi. "Did she give you any trouble?" "No, sir." The sergeant raised one eyebrow, almost surprised by the answer, before returning to his office without another word. Ethan escorted Naomi to a small interview room where sunlight filtered through narrow blinds, leaving long stripes across the polished table. He removed the restraints according to procedure and gestured toward the chair. "Someone will verify your identification shortly." Naomi sat gracefully, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket before folding her hands together once again. "Thank you, Officer Walker," she said. Ethan frowned slightly. "I never told you my name." A faint smile crossed her face. "Your name tag did." The answer was simple enough, yet somehow it made him feel as though she had noticed far more than the letters stitched above his pocket. Outside the room, Officer Melissa Carter accepted the identification Ethan had collected. She scanned the driver's license while entering the information into the department database. Her fingers moved confidently across the keyboard until they suddenly stopped. The clicking ceased. Her eyes narrowed at the monitor. She leaned closer, reading the screen a second time before blinking in disbelief. Without saying a word, she quietly minimized the record, checked the identification again, then reopened the file. Her breathing slowed. She looked toward the interview room where Naomi waited with remarkable patience. Then she stood, carrying the identification directly toward Sergeant Ross instead of returning it to Ethan. Across the station, conversations continued. Phones rang, and another officer laughed at something on the evening news playing silently on a television mounted near the ceiling. Only Ethan remained unaware that a single computer screen had just transformed an ordinary parking investigation into something that would soon be remembered throughout the entire department. Sergeant Daniel Ross accepted the driver's license without a word. But the moment he saw Officer Melissa Carter's expression, his own confidence faded. He stepped into his office, closed the glass door halfway, and looked down at the identification card resting on the folder in his hands. The room grew strangely quiet despite the constant rhythm of ringing telephones and distant conversations outside. Melissa turned the computer monitor slightly toward him. The official record remained open on the screen. Ross compared the photograph to the woman waiting calmly in the interview room. Then he looked again. Every detail matched. Date of birth, state identification number, government credentials attached to the record. His eyes narrowed as he continued reading, and the color slowly drained from his face. "You already verified this twice?" he asked quietly. Melissa nodded. "3 times, Sergeant. I thought the system had made a mistake." Ross exhaled slowly. It did not. Outside the office window, Ethan Walker leaned casually against the reception counter while finishing the last lines of his incident report. He could not see the computer screen. He only noticed Sergeant Ross looking toward him through the glass, with an expression that was impossible to read. It was not anger, it was not disappointment. It looked more like concern. Ethan assumed the paperwork simply required another signature. Across the hallway, Naomi Brooks remained seated exactly as Ethan had left her. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the interview table, illuminating tiny dust particles drifting through the still air. She listened quietly, as the courthouse clock several blocks away struck 4 slow chimes that echoed faintly through the city. Her attention settled briefly on the framed copy of the department mission statement hanging beside the door. Service, integrity, accountability. She read each word without changing her expression. The door opened gently. Sergeant Ross entered alone. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, Would you like some water while we finish verifying your information? Naomi smiled politely. That would be appreciated. Thank you. The difference in his tone would have escaped most people, but Ethan noticed it immediately from across the hallway. Only minutes earlier, Ross had sounded brisk and routine. Now every word seemed measured with unusual care. Ethan frowned. Something had changed. Ross returned carrying a bottle of water and placed it on the table himself, instead of asking another officer to do it. Naomi accepted it with a quiet thank you before looking toward him. May I ask how your first year as sergeant has been treating you? Ross blinked. You know that? Congratulations are still listed on the department newsletter. Ross allowed himself a small, surprised smile. I suppose they are. Before either of them could continue, the office telephone rang sharply. Melissa answered immediately, listened for several seconds, then looked toward Ross through the doorway. Chief Collins just called. He is on his way back to the station. He said nobody is to process any additional paperwork until he arrives. Ethan's stomach tightened. A police chief did not interrupt his schedule over an ordinary parking citation. He replayed every step of the afternoon in his head, searching for a mistake, but every procedure still seemed correct. Meanwhile, Naomi unscrewed the cap on the water bottle and took a slow sip before placing it neatly back on the table. Her eyes drifted once more toward the mission statement on the wall. Service, integrity, accountability. Then, almost to herself, she whispered with complete calm, those words only matter when people choose to live by them. Outside the interview room, no one spoke. The steady clicking of keyboards had stopped. Even the laughter near the television had faded. The entire station seemed to be waiting for someone to walk through the front doors, and for the first time since the afternoon began, Ethan Walker realized the story he believed he understood had only just begun. The front doors slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, and the conversations inside the station dissolved almost instantly. Chief Richard Collins stepped through the entrance carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm, his polished shoes clicking steadily across the tile floor. He had been scheduled to attend a community meeting across town, yet he had returned without explanation. Officers exchanged quick glances before quietly returning to their desks, pretending to focus on paperwork while following every movement from the corners of their eyes. Collins acknowledged no one at first. He walked directly toward Sergeant Daniel Ross. "Show me everything," he said calmly. Ross handed over the incident report, the driver's license, and the computer printout without a word. Collins read every page carefully. He never rushed. Every few moments he lifted his eyes toward the interview room, where Naomi Brooks still waited with remarkable composure. She remained seated exactly as before, the unopened bottle of water now resting neatly beside her folded hands. She looked neither impatient nor offended. She simply waited. Ethan Walker stood several feet away, trying to understand why an ordinary parking citation had suddenly become the center of attention for the entire command staff. His pulse quickened as Chief Collins reached the final page of the report. "Officer Walker," Collins called. Ethan stepped forward immediately. "Yes, sir. Walk me through everything from the beginning, slowly." Ethan took a careful breath. He described arriving at the shopping center after a parking complaint, observing the vehicle, identifying the apparent violation, requesting compliance, and documenting the encounter, according to department policy. His voice remained steady because he genuinely believed he had done everything correctly. Collins listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the chief asked only one question. "Did you allow her to explain why the vehicle was there?" Ethan hesitated for the first time that afternoon. "No, sir. I believe the violation itself was sufficient." Collins nodded once but offered no opinion. Instead, he opened the incident report again and compared every sentence against the body camera timestamp displayed on another monitor. The room remained almost perfectly silent, except for the quiet hum of fluorescent lights above. Melissa Carter noticed the clock on the wall ticking louder than she had ever remembered. Somewhere deeper inside the building, a copier began printing another stack of forms. Every ordinary sound suddenly felt unusually sharp. Collins finally closed the folder. "Before anyone reaches conclusions," he said evenly, "I want the complete body camera recording, the parking lot security footage, and the city maintenance report for that location." Ross immediately picked up the telephone. Melissa began requesting digital files from dispatch. Ethan watched the station come alive around him, every assignment moving with quiet urgency. None of it looked like preparation for disciplinary action. It looked like preparation to uncover the entire truth. Inside the interview room, Naomi heard the footsteps and distant voices, but made no attempt to listen through the closed door. Instead, she gazed through the narrow window toward the American flag standing outside the station entrance. The fabric shifted gently in the warm afternoon breeze. She smiled almost imperceptibly before whispering to herself, "Facts deserve patience." At nearly the same moment, an email notification appeared on Melissa's computer. The subject line read, "Municipal Traffic Maintenance Division." She opened the attached report, scanned the first paragraph, and her eyes widened. Without saying a single word, she carried the printed pages directly to Chief Collins. He read only the first few lines before lifting his head slowly toward Ethan. The silence that followed felt heavier than any lecture, because everyone in the room understood that the story was about to change in a way none of them had expected. Chief Richard Collins lowered the maintenance report onto the conference table with deliberate care, as though placing something fragile where everyone could finally see it. No one reached for the pages. No one spoke. The only sound came from the ventilation system pushing cool air through the station after another hot Georgia afternoon. Collins looked first at Sergeant Daniel Ross, then at Ethan Walker. "The city inspected that parking lot this morning," he said quietly. The fire lane sign was partially blocked by a commercial delivery trailer for nearly 40 minutes. Ethan stared at the report without fully understanding its significance. Collins continued. According to the maintenance supervisor, temporary visibility was compromised. The report also notes that officers responding to parking complaints were advised to evaluate the entire scene before taking enforcement action. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He remembered the delivery truck. He remembered hearing its engine idling while he focused on the vehicle. What he had not remembered was looking beyond it. He had seen the painted curb. He had never checked whether the warning sign itself could actually be seen by approaching drivers. Across the room, Melissa Carter quietly opened the body camera recording on a large monitor. The video began with Ethan stepping out of his patrol vehicle. Every movement looked professional. Every command sounded controlled. Then the recording captured Naomi beginning to raise one hand politely. "May I explain why I parked here?" she had asked. The recording also captured Ethan answering before she could finish. "You can explain after I finish my report." The room fell silent again. Nobody criticized him. Nobody rushed to judgment. They simply watched the remaining footage unfold exactly as it had happened. The camera showed the delivery trailer stretching across part of the lot, blocking the angle from which the fire lane sign would normally be visible. It showed Naomi calmly cooperating with every instruction. It showed nearby shoppers trying to say something before stopping when they realized the officer had already made up his mind. Finally, the recording reached the moment she quietly said, "Please finish your report carefully." Collins paused the video there. The image froze on Naomi's composed expression. "That sentence was not a threat," he said. "It was an invitation." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the polished floor. Until that moment, he had believed confidence came from making quick decisions. Now he began wondering whether real confidence required slowing down long enough to listen. Collins closed the laptop gently. "Authority allows an officer to act," he said. "Wisdom tells an officer when to ask one more question." No one argued because no one needed to. The lesson was already settling over the room. Before anyone could speak again, a courthouse liaison entered the station carrying a sealed envelope. She approached the chief, greeted him politely, and handed over the official correspondence. "This was scheduled for delivery to Judge Naomi Brooks this afternoon," she explained. "Her chambers asked us to make sure it reached her today because tomorrow's docket begins at 8:30 sharp." Ethan's heartbeat seemed to stop. The words echoed inside his mind long after the liaison had finished speaking. Judge Naomi Brooks. The title settled over the station like a heavy silence. Melissa slowly closed her eyes. Sergeant Ross exhaled through pursed lips. Chief Collins looked toward the interview room where Naomi still sat peacefully beside the window, unaware that everyone outside had finally reached the same realization. Ethan remained completely still. For the first time since putting on his uniform, he understood that the person he had judged within seconds was someone whose entire career had been built on doing exactly the opposite. The revelation moved through the station without a single raised voice. It did not need one. Every officer who quietly learned the name on the courthouse envelope instinctively lowered their tone, as though respect itself had entered the building. Ethan Walker remained frozen beside the reception counter, staring at the polished floor while fragments of the afternoon replayed inside his mind with painful clarity. He remembered the heat rising from the asphalt. He remembered interrupting her before she could explain. Most of all, he remembered believing certainty was the same thing as professionalism. Chief Richard Collins picked up the envelope and walked toward the interview room himself. He paused briefly outside the door, straightened his jacket, and knocked gently before entering. Naomi Brooks looked up from the chair and offered the same calm smile she had worn since arriving. "Good afternoon, Chief Collins," she said. "It has been quite some time." Collins smiled politely. "Far longer than it should have been, Judge Brooks." Ethan heard the words clearly through the partially open doorway. Hearing the title spoken aloud somehow carried even greater weight than reading it on a computer screen. Judge Brooks accepted the envelope without immediately opening it. Instead, she placed it neatly beside the unopened case file she had been carrying since the beginning of the afternoon. "I imagine your officers have had a busy day," she said. Collins nodded once. "We are reviewing every detail." Naomi looked toward the hallway where Ethan stood, though she could only see part of his shoulder through the narrow opening in the door. "That is all anyone should ever ask," she replied. "Review the facts before deciding what they mean." Her voice carried no bitterness, no accusation, only quiet conviction. Collins remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "Judge Brooks, I would like to apologize for the circumstances that brought you here today." Naomi gently raised one hand. "Chief, apologies are meaningful only after understanding. I would rather your department learn something lasting than simply say something polite." Those words settled over Collins with visible weight. He gave a respectful nod before stepping back into the hallway. Outside the interview room, Ethan could not bring himself to meet the chief's eyes. "Walk with me," Collins said. They entered a nearby conference room overlooking the station parking lot. The evening sun had begun sinking lower, casting long golden reflections across the windshields of patrol vehicles lined neatly outside. Collins closed the door behind them. "Do you know what concerns me most about today?" Ethan answered honestly. "That I detained a judge, sir." Collins slowly shook his head. "No, anyone can hold an important title. That is not the lesson." Ethan looked up, uncertain. Collins folded his hands behind his back. "What concerns me is that you stopped investigating the moment you believed you already knew the answer." The room became very quiet. Ethan felt those words strike harder than any formal reprimand could have. They were true. Every decision afterward had simply confirmed the conclusion he had already chosen. He had listened only enough to support what he believed. He had never listened to understand. Collins rested one hand lightly on the conference table. "The badge gives you legal authority. It does not give you perfect judgment. That has to be earned every single day." Ethan nodded slowly, unable to offer an excuse, because none existed. Beyond the conference room window, the American flag outside the station continued moving gently in the warm breeze. Its steady motion reminded him that institutions remained strong only when the people inside them were willing to question themselves. For the first time since graduating from the academy, Ethan realized that becoming a good police officer had far less to do with proving he was right than having the humility to discover when he might be wrong. Evening settled gently over the station, washing the windows with warm amber light that softened the sharp edges of desks, filing cabinets, and framed commendations. The pace of the building slowed as the busiest hours faded, yet no one seemed eager to leave. An unusual stillness lingered in every hallway, as though the entire department understood that the most important work of the day no longer involved paperwork. Chief Richard Collins stood outside the interview room for several moments before quietly opening the door once again. "Judge Brooks," he said respectfully, "if you are willing, I would like to ask one favor." Naomi looked up from the envelope resting unopened beside her. "Go ahead." Collins glanced briefly toward the hallway where Ethan remained standing alone. "Would you be willing to speak with Officer Walker before you leave?" Naomi followed his gaze through the narrow glass panel. The young officer stood motionless beside the window overlooking the parking lot, his report still folded beneath one arm. He no longer looked like someone protecting his authority. He looked like someone questioning it. Naomi answered without hesitation. Yes. Collins thanked her quietly before motioning for Ethan to enter. The chief closed the door behind him, leaving the room wrapped in a silence that felt uncomfortable only to one of them. Ethan stopped several feet from the table. He had rehearsed countless explanations while walking across the hallway, yet every sentence disappeared the moment he met Naomi's eyes. She did not appear disappointed. She did not appear offended. She simply waited with the same patience she had shown since the beginning of the afternoon. Ethan finally spoke. I owe you an apology. Naomi remained silent, encouraging him to continue. I believed I was doing my job correctly, he admitted. But I never gave you the chance to explain. I decided what happened before I knew everything that happened. His voice was steady but quieter than before. Naomi nodded gently. That realization matters more than you may realize. Ethan lowered his eyes. I embarrassed you in public, she answered calmly. You embarrassed yourself more than you embarrassed me. He looked up, surprised not by the words themselves, but by the absence of anger behind them. Naomi folded her hands together. Do you know why I never argued with you? Ethan slowly shook his head. Because arguing rarely changes a mind that has already reached its destination, she replied. Listening does. The room fell quiet once again. Outside the window, the last rays of sunlight reflected across the roofs of the patrol cars parked in neat rows. Their flashing emergency lights were off now, leaving only ordinary vehicles beneath an ordinary sky. Naomi reached toward the folded incident report lying beneath Ethan's arm. May I see it? He handed it to her immediately. She read every page carefully, never rushing, occasionally tracing a line with one finger before continuing. Finally, she returned the report without making a single mark. Your writing is organized, she observed. Your timeline is clear. Your facts are incomplete. Ethan felt those 4 words settle deeply inside him. Facts are incomplete, Naomi continued softly. A report is not only a record of what an officer sees. It is a record of what an officer chooses to notice. Ethan looked down at the pages in his hands. The sentences had not changed, but somehow they no longer described the truth as completely as he once believed. Before standing to leave, Naomi offered one final thought. Please finish your report carefully. This time Ethan understood what she had meant hours earlier in the parking lot. She had never been asking him to protect her. She had been asking him to protect the truth, because the truth deserved more patience than assumptions ever could. The station doors opened quietly, and the first cool breeze of the evening drifted across the lobby, carrying the distant scent of fresh rain even though the sky remained clear. Judge Naomi Brooks stepped into the hallway beside Chief Richard Collins, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged. Several officers instinctively straightened as she passed, not because anyone ordered them to, but because respect had quietly replaced assumption. Ethan Walker followed several steps behind, still holding the incident report that no longer felt complete in his hands. Every sentence inside it reminded him not of what he had documented, but of everything he had failed to see. At the reception desk, Sergeant Daniel Ross approached Naomi with a small brown envelope. Judge Brooks, these are your personal belongings, he said. Everything has been accounted for. Naomi accepted the envelope with a grateful smile. Thank you, Sergeant. Ross hesitated for a moment before speaking again. For what it is worth, I appreciate the way you handled today. Naomi looked at him kindly. The way people respond after a mistake often matters more than the mistake itself. Ross lowered his eyes thoughtfully, absorbing every word. Outside, the courthouse clock echoed 5 slow chimes across the downtown streets. Naomi glanced toward the sound before checking the silver watch on her wrist. I should be going, she said. Tomorrow begins early. Collins nodded. Our department will complete a full review before the morning. I hope you do, Naomi replied. Not because of me. Because the next person may not have the same patience. The sentence lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. Ethan finally stepped forward. Judge Brooks. She turned toward him. May I ask you one question? She smiled gently. Of course. Ethan looked genuinely uncertain. When you realized who I was, why did you never tell me who you were? Naomi considered the question for a brief moment before answering. Because my title should never determine whether I deserve fairness. Ethan remained silent. She continued softly. If respect depends on discovering someone's position, then it was never respect to begin with. Those words settled over him with even greater force than anything Chief Collins had said earlier. Ethan realized that if she had introduced herself as a judge during the encounter, the entire situation would probably have unfolded differently. And that was exactly the problem. Fairness could not depend on status. It had to begin long before names, professions, or titles entered the conversation. Naomi adjusted the strap of her leather case and started toward the front entrance. As the automatic doors opened, the fading sunlight wrapped the sidewalk outside in warm shades of gold and copper. Before stepping through, she paused and looked back one final time. Her eyes met Ethan's. Officer Walker. Yes, ma'am? Never stop asking one more question before making your final decision. Ethan nodded quietly. I will remember that. She smiled, then disappeared into the evening crowd, blending almost immediately among office workers, families, and commuters, heading home after another ordinary day. Watching her leave, Ethan understood something that had never been mentioned during the academy. The strongest people were often the ones who never needed to remind others who they were. They simply carried themselves with quiet dignity until everyone else finally noticed. Inside the station, the lobby gradually returned to its usual rhythm. Telephones rang again. Keyboards resumed clicking. Conversations slowly restarted. Yet for Ethan, nothing sounded quite the same. The building had not changed. The badge on his chest had not changed, but the person wearing it had already begun to. The following morning arrived wrapped in cool gray light as downtown slowly awakened beneath a sky still carrying the soft colors of dawn. Commuters filled the sidewalks with coffee cups in hand. Courthouse employees hurried through the front entrance with briefcases tucked beneath their arms, and the bronze scales above the courthouse doors caught the first rays of sunlight. Ethan Walker stood alone across the street inside his patrol vehicle, watching the building with a different perspective than he had only 24 hours earlier. Chief Richard Collins had reassigned him to courthouse security for the morning, not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to observe how justice continued long after an arrest ended. Ethan stepped out of the cruiser, adjusted his uniform, and crossed the wide stone plaza. Every footstep echoed against the polished marble beneath his boots. Inside, the courthouse carried an entirely different atmosphere from the police station. Conversations remained quiet. Cell phones disappeared into pockets. Even hurried footsteps seemed to slow beneath the high ceilings and sunlight filtering through tall windows. Justice, Ethan realized, demanded a different kind of silence. He checked in with the court security supervisor before taking his assigned position near the rear of courtroom 3. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched toward the front, where the judge's bench stood elevated beneath the American flag and the state seal. Lawyers quietly reviewed folders. A court reporter arranged neatly stacked notebooks beside the recording equipment. Members of the public filtered inside, each carrying their own worries, hopes, and unanswered questions. At precisely 8:30, the courtroom clerk stood. All rise. Every person in the room rose together. Ethan followed instinctively. Judge Naomi Brooks entered through the side door wearing a simple black judicial robe that concealed every sign of status except the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. She acknowledged the courtroom with a gentle nod before taking her seat. Her expression looked exactly as it had inside the interview room the previous afternoon. Calm, focused, unhurried. Nothing in her face suggested resentment. Nothing suggested she had spent the previous day inside a police station. She simply opened the first case file and began working. Ethan watched carefully as one hearing followed another. Naomi listened far longer than anyone spoke. She allowed every attorney to finish before asking thoughtful questions. She occasionally paused for several seconds before responding, never appearing uncomfortable with silence. Instead, she seemed to treat silence as another form of evidence. Around mid-morning, one attorney began explaining a parking citation dispute involving unclear street markings. Ethan's attention sharpened immediately. Naomi listened without interruption before asking a single question. Before issuing the citation, did anyone verify whether the signs were visible from the driver's point of view? The courtroom became quiet. The attorney admitted the issue had not been fully examined. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. Facts deserve context before conclusions, she said evenly. Otherwise, we risk judging people instead of situations. Ethan felt the words settle deeply inside him because he knew they were not spoken for his benefit alone. They were a principle she applied equally to every person who entered her courtroom. Watching from the back row, he finally understood why she had remained so composed the previous afternoon. Her confidence had never come from authority. It came from years of choosing patience over assumption. As the hearing concluded and the next case was called, Ethan quietly opened the small notebook he now carried in his uniform pocket. Beneath yesterday's unfinished report, he wrote only one sentence. Ask one more question before believing you already have the answer. By late afternoon, the courthouse had settled into a quieter rhythm. The long morning calendar was finished, attorneys drifted through the marble hallways speaking in lowered voices, and sunlight poured through the tall windows, stretching golden rectangles across the polished floor. Ethan Walker remained at his security post near the courtroom entrance, but he no longer watched people the way he had the day before. Instead of looking for violations first, he found himself studying expressions, listening to conversations, noticing details that once seemed unimportant. Every face carried a story he could not see at first glance. As Judge Naomi Brooks exited the courtroom with a stack of files tucked beneath one arm, several court employees greeted her by name. She returned every greeting with the same quiet warmth, stopping briefly to thank a maintenance worker polishing the hallway railings and asking a receptionist how her grandson was recovering after surgery. None of those exchanges lasted more than a few seconds, yet each person smiled a little brighter after speaking with her. Ethan watched from a distance, realizing that genuine respect could not be demanded by a title. It was earned one ordinary conversation at a time. Before Naomi reached her chambers, an elderly man sitting alone on a wooden bench stood slowly, clutching a faded envelope in trembling hands. "Your Honor," he called softly. Court security instinctively glanced toward him, but Naomi simply walked over. "Good afternoon, Mr. Franklin," she said with an easy smile, remembering his name without hesitation. "Did everything go all right today?" The man lowered his eyes. "I wanted to thank you. Last year you told me not to give up after my housing dispute. You said to keep bringing the truth one document at a time. I finally won my appeal this morning." He held up the envelope. "These are the keys to my apartment. I almost lost everything." Naomi accepted neither the envelope nor the praise. Instead, she gently patted his shoulder. "You earned that outcome because you stayed honest and patient." Tears gathered in the man's eyes as he thanked her again before quietly walking toward the courthouse exit. Ethan felt something shift inside him. The courtroom decisions he had witnessed were only part of her work. The greater impact appeared afterward, in the lives that quietly continued, because someone had taken the time to listen fairly. Moments later, Chief Richard Collins arrived at the courthouse carrying a slim folder. He had scheduled a private meeting with Naomi regarding the department's internal review. Ethan expected a tense conversation. Instead, Collins emerged nearly 30 minutes later looking thoughtful rather than relieved. As he passed Ethan in the hallway, the young officer stood a little straighter. "Sir?" Collins stopped. "Yes, officer?" Ethan hesitated before asking the question that had weighed on him all day. "Is she filing a complaint against me?" Collins looked at him for a long moment before answering, "No." Ethan blinked. "She is not?" Collins slowly shook his head. "Judge Brooks said something I hope you never forget. She told me that correcting a person creates more justice than simply punishing one who is willing to learn." Ethan stood silently as those words settled into his heart. Collins continued walking toward the elevators before adding one final sentence over his shoulder. "Do not mistake mercy for approval. She expects you to become the officer you are capable of becoming." The elevator doors closed softly, leaving Ethan alone beneath the afternoon light. For the first time since joining the department, he realized that the greatest consequence of his mistake was not the embarrassment he carried. It was the responsibility to prove that the lesson had truly changed him. The next week passed quietly, yet every shift felt different to Ethan Walker. The routines remained the same. Patrol cars rolled out before sunrise. Dispatch radios crackled with familiar voices. Coffee brewed in the break room before dawn. But inside Ethan, something had changed that no uniform could hide. His notebook grew thicker each day with observations instead of assumptions. After every call, he asked one additional question before closing his report. More than once, that single extra question completely changed the outcome. Chief Richard Collins noticed without saying much. Growth, he believed, spoke loudest when it happened, without applause. Late Friday afternoon, another parking complaint came through dispatch. A small delivery van had been reported blocking access outside a neighborhood pharmacy. Ethan acknowledged the call and arrived within minutes. The scene looked simple at first glance. The van was parked awkwardly near the curb, while several frustrated drivers waited nearby. A younger version of himself would have stepped out, already convinced he knew exactly what had happened. Instead, he paused. He looked beyond the vehicle before reaching for his citation book. He noticed orange construction cones half hidden behind a utility truck. He noticed fresh pavement markings leading traffic into a temporary lane. Most importantly, he noticed an elderly woman standing beside the delivery van, struggling to balance two grocery bags while speaking with the driver. Ethan approached calmly. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said. "Can someone help me understand what happened?" The driver explained that construction crews had redirected traffic only 30 minutes earlier. The temporary loading zone signs had not yet been uncovered after road repairs. The elderly woman quietly added that the driver had stopped only long enough to help carry her groceries because she had recently undergone knee surgery. Ethan listened without interruption. He walked the entire block, confirmed the temporary traffic changes with a construction supervisor, and photographed the covered signs before making any decision. By the time he returned, the misunderstanding had already resolved itself. No citation was necessary. The delivery van pulled away legally. The elderly woman smiled gratefully before continuing toward her apartment building. "Thank you for listening first," she said. Those 4 words stayed with Ethan for the rest of the afternoon. Back at the station, he completed his report with unusual care. Every observation was supported by photographs. Every timeline included context. Before submitting the paperwork, he quietly read it one final time. "Please finish your report carefully." The sentence no longer echoed as a reminder of failure. It had become part of the way he worked. As he placed the completed report into Sergeant Daniel Ross's inbox, Ross skimmed the first page before looking up with a faint smile. "You walked the entire scene before making a decision." Ethan nodded. "I realized that the truth is usually a little farther away than the first thing we see." Ross closed the folder. Good police work begins exactly there. As evening settled over the city, Ethan stood outside the station watching the American flag move gently against the deep blue sky. He understood now that learning had not erased his mistake. It had given the mistake a purpose. Somewhere across town, inside quiet courthouse chambers, Judge Naomi Brooks was likely finishing another day's work with the same patience she had shown him from the beginning. She had not changed the past. She had changed the officer who would walk into tomorrow, and that difference would reach people she would probably never meet. Nearly 3 months passed before Ethan Walker and Judge Naomi Brooks found themselves in the same place again. Autumn had settled across the city, painting courthouse trees with deep shades of gold and crimson, while cool morning air carried the scent of fallen leaves through downtown streets. Ethan had grown accustomed to beginning every shift with the same quiet ritual. Before climbing into his patrol vehicle, he opened the small notebook tucked inside his uniform pocket and reread the sentence that had reshaped his career. "Ask one more question before believing you already have the answer." The words no longer felt like a reminder of failure. They had become part of his character. That Tuesday morning, Chief Richard Collins asked Ethan to assist with courthouse security during a civic education event for local high school students. Teenagers filled the public gallery, whispering excitedly as teachers encouraged them to observe how the justice system truly worked. Ethan greeted visitors at the entrance, answering questions politely and directing families toward available seating. Everything moved calmly until Judge Naomi Brooks entered the courtroom. As always, conversations softened without anyone asking them to. Respect followed her naturally. During a break between presentations, one student raised a hand. "Your Honor," she asked, "what is the most important quality for someone who wants to work in law?" The courtroom became still. Naomi smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Humility." Several students looked surprised. One expected her to say intelligence. Another quietly whispered integrity. Naomi continued, Knowledge helps you understand laws. Humility reminds you that no human being sees every fact at first glance. Ethan listened from the back of the room, recognizing the lesson immediately. Naomi glanced briefly toward him before returning her attention to the students. The strongest professionals are not the ones who never make mistakes. They are the ones who are willing to recognize them, learn from them, and become safer for everyone they serve. The presentation ended with warm applause. As families slowly exited the courtroom, Ethan remained behind, helping stack folding chairs along the side wall. Naomi gathered her notes and approached him with the same calm smile he remembered from the parking lot months earlier. "Officer Walker," she said. "Judge Brooks." He smiled in return. "I wanted to thank you." She tilted her head slightly. "For what?" Ethan looked around the nearly empty courtroom before answering. "For giving me the opportunity to become better instead of simply becoming ashamed." Naomi considered his words carefully. "Shame rarely teaches people anything lasting," she replied. "Responsibility does." Ethan nodded. "I understand that now." She noticed the small notebook tucked inside his breast pocket. "Do you still carry it?" He smiled. Every day, he opened it and showed her the first page. Beneath the original sentence were dozens of handwritten notes gathered from months of patrol work, each one reminding him to slow down, observe carefully, and listen completely before deciding. Naomi looked at the worn pages for a quiet moment before closing the notebook gently. "Then my work here is finished." Ethan shook his head softly. "I think it is only beginning." As they walked together toward the courthouse entrance, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, filling the marble hallway with warm golden light. Neither of them spoke again. They did not need to. Sometimes the deepest reconciliation required no dramatic speech, only two people continuing forward with greater wisdom than they had carried before. 1 year later, the city looked much the same, yet for Ethan Walker, every familiar street carried a different meaning. Morning sunlight reflected across storefront windows, school buses followed their usual routes, and the steady rhythm of downtown life unfolded one ordinary moment at a time. His patrol vehicle rolled quietly through neighborhoods he now knew by more than street names. He recognized the barber who always waved before opening his shop, the bakery owner who greeted every customer with the same cheerful smile, and the crossing guard who never missed a single child walking to school. Every interaction reminded him that policing was never only about enforcing rules, it was about protecting people. Late that afternoon, dispatch reported another parking complaint outside a busy medical clinic. Ethan arrived to find several frustrated drivers gathered near the entrance. A sedan sat awkwardly near a restricted area, while an older man leaned against the vehicle looking overwhelmed. Another officer had already reached for a citation book and was preparing to begin documenting the violation. Ethan quietly walked over. "Before we decide anything," he said with calm professionalism, "let us understand what happened." The other officer paused. Ethan noticed something familiar almost immediately. A temporary construction barrier blocked the nearest parking sign from approaching traffic, just as another obstacle had done months before. He spoke briefly with the clinic receptionist, then with a construction foreman replacing damaged concrete nearby. Within minutes, the situation became clear. The driver had followed temporary directions provided by clinic staff after accessible parking spaces had been unexpectedly closed for repairs. There had been no attempt to ignore the rules, only confusion created by incomplete information. Ethan thanked everyone for their patience and helped redirect traffic until maintenance crews uncovered the temporary signs. As the small crowd dispersed, the older driver smiled with visible relief. "Thank you for listening first, officer." Ethan smiled warmly. Everyone deserves that. The words felt natural now, no longer something he had practiced, but something he genuinely believed. Several days later, Chief Richard Collins called Ethan into his office. A framed certificate rested on the desk beside a fresh pot of coffee. Collins slid the paper across without ceremony. "Your field training evaluation is complete," he said. Ethan looked down. Beginning the following month, he would help mentor newly assigned officers during their first weeks on patrol. He looked up, surprised. "Me, sir?" Collins nodded. "Experience matters. Character matters more." Ethan accepted the assignment quietly, understanding that the opportunity carried far greater responsibility than recognition. On his first morning as a mentor, He handed every rookie officer a small pocket notebook before they left the station. Most looked puzzled. One finally asked, "What are we supposed to write in these?" Ethan opened his own worn notebook, its pages filled with observations gathered over the past year. He pointed to the very first sentence, now faded slightly from constant reading. "Ask one more question before believing you already have the answer." The young officers copied the words onto their own first pages without fully understanding why. Someday they would. As evening settled across the city, Ethan stood outside the station, watching the American flag move gently beneath a sky glowing with the last colors of sunset. Somewhere across town, Judge Naomi Brooks was likely finishing another day of listening before deciding, just as she always had. They rarely crossed paths anymore, yet her greatest lesson continued reaching people she would never meet. She had not changed the law. She had not changed the city overnight. She had simply changed one officer who would spend the rest of his career choosing patience over assumption. And sometimes one changed heart becomes the quiet beginning of justice for countless others.